Buried beneath victory parades and the illusion of peace lies a silence too deliberate to ignore. Documents blacked out, names erased, machines dismantled under the cover of night, yet the echoes of those secrets bleed through the cracks. These are not tales of glory, but of shadows, experiments abandoned, prisoners uncounted, weapons that whispered too loudly. What was hidden was not meant to protect us. It was meant to disappear, as if history itself could be rewritten by omission. In late March of 1945, with the Reich crumbling and American armored columns pushing east into Saxony, a reconnaissance platoon from the US 9th Armored Division stumbled upon a sealed tunnel entrance in the Harz Mountains, not far from Blankenberg. According to a field report, the entryway was reinforced with freshly poured concrete and marked by hastily affixed warning signs in German. Suchengefahr, danger of epidemic. Yet the patrol noticed no signs of quarantine, only the distinct sound of diesel generators echoing faintly beneath the mountain rock. The structure became known in post-war Allied intelligence files as Anlage Fünf, Installation 5, though German documents later revealed no such designation in Wehrmacht archives. Within days of its discovery, combat engineers from the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion blasted open the access point. What they found inside would never appear in any official occupation reports. Witness testimony, pieced together from diaries and after-action notes, describes a labyrinth of chambers lined with crates bearing Luftwaffe markings, many with stenciled codes matching experimental divisions of the Erprobungskommando. Captain Neu, Harold R. Miles, whose letters to his wife were later obtained by his family under the Freedom of Information Act, wrote in April 1945. These weren't supplies, they were prototypes, models, and files. Some looked like aircraft fuselage sections, but built with alloys I've never seen before. They didn't rust or bend when struck. The trove reportedly contained engines lacking any known identification numbers, sketches of rocket-assisted interceptors, and binders filled with handwritten notes in Sütterlin script. A particularly detailed file bore the title Projekt, Morgenrot, Project Dawn, an initiative never once mentioned in captured Luftwaffe command records. According to a debriefing of German prisoners at the time, Morgenrot was believed to have been overseen directly by General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch, though no surviving paper trail confirms this. By April 3rd, officers from the Office of Strategic Services arrived at the site, escorted by military police. A young sergeant named Daniel Roth later recalled in an oral history interview, "We were ordered to hand over everything to the OSS detail. They loaded crate after crate onto trucks marked only with tarps. Within 48 hours, the entire tunnel was emptied. No reports, no records, nothing filed through Army channels." Strangely, the official US Army occupation logs for the Harz sector omit any mention of the installation. Local German civilians, however, remembered the sudden influx of American vehicles and the strict cordon placed around the mountainside. One farmer, interviewed decades later, said, "For 3 days, no one was allowed near. We heard the blasting, at night, and then the convoys. Then suddenly it was silent, as if nothing had been there." In the years immediately after the war, Operation Paperclip quietly brought hundreds of German scientists and engineers to American soil. Researchers who reviewed fragmentary personnel lists from Anlage Fünf noted familiar names later tied to US aerospace programs, though the documents remain heavily redacted. A memorandum dated July 1946 from Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, where many paperclip recruits were interrogated, makes an oblique reference to Harz Mountain material, but the subsequent pages of the file were excised before release. Rumors persisted within NATO circles during the 1950s that prototypes taken from Anlage Fünf had influenced early American jet propulsion tests. Declassified CIA cables from 1952 reveal internal disputes between the United States and Britain regarding exclusive possession of German-engineered aeronautical data. One British intelligence officer, writing to the Foreign Office, complained, "Our American partners have deliberately concealed their Hart's acquisition. The resulting imbalance in knowledge threatens long-term parity." The cable was promptly classified under special handling. Perhaps most disturbing are the personnel rosters allegedly recovered from the site. A fragment leaked in 1978 lists 6 engineers attached to Technisches Amt GLCE2 Pfalz, a Luftwaffe design bureau responsible for radar and experimental avionics. Each name on the roster was later traced to immigration records showing US residency under paperclip sponsorship. What makes the list remarkable is that all 6 were reported killed in action during Allied bombings of Berlin in early 1945. The discrepancy has never been reconciled. The tunnels themselves were resealed by US forces after the crates were removed. In 1991, following German reunification, a team of amateur historians attempted to locate the site. Guided by fragmentary maps from wartime archives, they reported finding collapsed entrances and twisted steel beams deep in the Hart's range, but no remaining infrastructure. German municipal officials dismissed their findings as natural cave systems. Even so, aerial reconnaissance photos taken by the US Army Air Forces in April 1945, released under the National Archives catalogue in 2003, show a distinctly rectangular scar on the mountainside, where Anlage Fünf was said to be located. The area has since been reforested, obscuring the terrain. The question remains, what, precisely, was stored within Anlage Fünf? If the crates contained only routine prototypes, why were they stripped from official records and transported under OSS control? Why were key personnel erased from German casualty lists only to reappear in US immigration files? And why do so many archival references to Hart's material terminate abruptly with pages missing or classified under origin-sensitive clauses? Former intelligence officers have suggested that the installation represented not merely a stockpile of designs, but an entire research program transferred intact into Allied hands. Others contend it was nothing more than a collection of incomplete models, inflated by rumor and Cold War secrecy. Yet the absence of definitive documentation, the silence in both German and American records, speaks louder than testimony. It is as though Anlage Fünf was deliberately erased from history, leaving only whispers in declassified fragments and fading memories of soldiers who walked its halls for just a few hours in the final days of the war. The Hart's remains quiet today, its forests concealing whatever traces may endure. But in the sealed vaults of Allied archives, behind pages blacked out by censors, the story of Anlage Fünf lingers like a ghost, an unacknowledged inheritance of war, transferred from a dying Reich into the shadows of the Cold War that followed. In the winter of 1948, a single intercepted Soviet transmission set off a chain of whispers within British intelligence. The fragment, decrypted at Bletchley Park's successor unit in Eastcote, spoke of Anglo prisoners held at a special camp east of Sverdlovsk. The message was brief, heavily coded, and never repeated, but its implications were staggering. Royal Air Force aircrew, missing since 1945, might still be alive in Soviet custody. The mission to investigate would become known in surviving files as Operation Silver Ash, a codename that appears only once in declassified British records before vanishing into bureaucratic silence. The genesis of Silver Ash can be traced to the fate of several RAF squadrons lost during the war's closing months. In early 1945, dozens of British bombers went missing over East Prussia during night raids. Their crews never recovered. Official records attributed these losses to heavy German flak and the chaos of retreating fronts. Yet some airmen were reported, captured, and rumors persisted of Soviet units seizing prisoners from German camps before Allied authorities could intervene. With the onset of the Cold War, such disappearances became diplomatically inconvenient to acknowledge. A confidential memorandum dated March 12, 1948, from Air Vice Marshal Norman Bottomley to the Foreign Office, outlines the problem with clinical precision. Evidence suggests that certain Commonwealth prisoners believed liberated by Soviet forces in Königsberg sector did not repatriate. Their whereabouts remain unconfirmed. The matter, if pursued publicly, risks severe embarrassment. Bottomley recommended quiet verification through deniable channels, a phrase intelligence historians now recognize as authorization for covert inquiry. The man selected to lead the inquiry was Colonel Peter R. Lasselle, a veteran of the Special Operations Executive. Lasselle had operated clandestinely in occupied France and carried a reputation for discretion. He assembled a small cell of ex-SOE operatives and former RAF intelligence officers. Their task was not to mount a rescue, but to establish whether the Soviet claim had any basis. Funding was minimal, paperwork non-existent. Silver Ash did not officially exist. The first phase involved combing German and Polish refugee testimonies in displaced persons camps across the British zone. Lasselle's team interviewed witnesses who claimed to have seen British flyers marched eastward by Red Army guards in 1945. Several accounts, though vague, pointed to transports heading toward Brest-Litovsk before vanishing into Soviet territory. A surviving field note from June 1948 records one Polish witness insisting he had seen men with RAF uniforms, badges torn off, in cattle cars bound for Minsk. The note was annotated in pencil. Possible confirmation: keep quiet. By autumn, Lasselle's men made cautious contact with elements of the German underground still active in the Soviet zone. One courier reported that foreigners had been seen at a labor camp near Perm, engaged in construction of airfields. The report, funneled back through MI6 channels, was considered credible enough to escalate. In November 1948, Lasselle himself traveled under diplomatic cover to Helsinki, where he arranged a clandestine meeting with a Finnish trader who claimed Soviet officers had bragged about holding English pilots as bargaining chips. No names were provided, only the cryptic phrase, "They are alive, but not for exchange." At this point, the trail grows darker. A series of heavily redacted Foreign Office cables, stamped "Most Secret Personal for Attlee," suggest that British leadership debated confronting Moscow through back channels. The idea was abandoned, apparently out of fear that raising the issue would expose Britain's intelligence penetration of Soviet communications. A handwritten note in the margin of one file reads, "Too dangerous, better to bury than risk disclosure." What became of Lasselle's cell is equally murky. A diary fragment from one of his operatives, Flight Lieutenant Raymond Meacham, describes a December 1948 journey through occupied Austria, where they met a Soviet defector claiming to have guarded Western flyers near Sverdlovsk. Meacham writes, "His account matches too closely to be ignored. At least 4, maybe 5 men, English by speech. He swore one gave his name as Flight Officer Turner. We checked. Turner listed MIA 1945, Königsberg." Days later, Meacham ceased writing. His widow later testified that he never returned from Vienna. By early 1949, Silver Ash appears to have been terminated. Internal memoranda ceased. Personnel files were sealed. When questioned in 1953, Lasselle's denied ever hearing of the mission, though a slip in one interview transcript records him saying, "They were alive, but politics did not allow it." He retracted the statement immediately. The broader context cannot be ignored. In the same period, the Soviets were consolidating control over Eastern Europe and hardening borders. To admit that Western POWs were still in Soviet hands would have triggered a diplomatic crisis. Britain, exhausted by war and dependent on US support, could ill afford confrontation. The men of Silver Ash were sacrificed not on the battlefield, but on the altar of geopolitics. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, families of missing RAF aircrew pressed for access to Russian archives. Some progress was made. Lists of foreign prisoners at labor camps did surface, though names were often incomplete or intentionally altered. Among them were at least 2 entries under T. One, recorded at Camp 27 near Perm in 1946, reads simply, "Turner, aviator." British authorities dismissed the document as non-conclusive. The families were not convinced. Even now, Operation Silver Ash remains absent from official British history. Requests under the Freedom of Information Act return the same answer. No records found. And yet, scattered fragments, an intercepted cable, a redacted memorandum, a witness testimony suppressed for decades, point to a buried truth: that some British airmen did not return in 1945, but vanished into the vast prison network of the Soviet Union. Their fate remains one of the Cold War's earliest unspoken bargains. Men who survived the firestorms over East Prussia, only to be swallowed by another iron wall, erased not by enemy gunfire but by silence engineered in London and Moscow alike. A silence that endures, more than 70 years later, in the blank spaces of official archives and the unanswered questions of families who still wait. In the spring of 1943, amid the brutal contest of the Battle of the Atlantic, a small group within the Kriegsmarine quietly initiated trials of a submarine unlike any the Allies had encountered. Designated only as U-13X in scattered German engineering notes, the vessel was constructed at the Kiel shipyards under extraordinary secrecy. Even within the Kriegsmarine's U-Boot-Waffe, few officers knew of its existence. The project did not appear in standard fleet records, and its construction was masked as an industrial barge program on requisition forms. What made U-13X unique was its propulsion system. According to fragments recovered after the war, the vessel was designed to remain submerged for weeks, perhaps indefinitely, without surfacing to recharge batteries. While standard U-boats of the era were shackled by their reliance on diesel engines and vulnerable schnorkels, U-13X appears to have incorporated an advanced closed-cycle turbine system, powered by concentrated hydrogen peroxide, an experimental technology the Germans called Walter Antrieb. Only a handful of prototypes were ever rumoured, most never leaving harbour. Yet U-13X, according to scattered post-war reports, did. A surviving memorandum dated June 17, 1943, from the Kriegsmarine's Marinewerft Kiel, references special trials of experimental craft escorted under guard to Baltic testing grounds near Gotland. Witnesses, local fishermen later interviewed by Allied interrogators, spoke of a vessel longer and quieter than any U-boat, escorted by 2 minesweepers. The submarine disappeared beneath the waves and, for a week, failed to re-emerge. Rumours circulated among naval crews that the boat could run faster submerged than surfaced, a claim dismissed at the time as fantasy. By late 1944, as the Reich collapsed, the project vanished from German naval correspondence. No commissioning documents exist. No commanding officer is named in the surviving roles. Yet in 1947, Swedish Coast Guard patrols recovered wreckage. Off Gotland's coast, twisted hull plating marked with serial stamps matching Kiel's wartime shipyard. The debris was quietly passed to Soviet naval authorities, who demanded access under post-war agreements. Within months, Soviet trawlers appeared in the Baltic, and the wreckage was transported under cover of night to Murmansk. Sweden received nothing in return. For decades, the story of U-13X was little more than a rumour, until NATO analysts in the 1960s examined classified photographs from Soviet naval archives obtained through espionage. Among them were images of a partially reconstructed submarine hull with features unfamiliar to Allied engineers. Smooth hydrodynamic curves, no visible exhaust ports, and reinforced compartments resembling pressure-resistant tanks. One British analyst scrawled in the margin, "This is not post-war Soviet design. This is German." The photographs were stamped origin sensitive and filed away. What troubled NATO officials was the technological leap implied. If the Germans had succeeded in building a functional closed-cycle submarine in 1943, they had briefly achieved what navies elsewhere would not replicate until decades later. The very concept of an air-independent propulsion system was years ahead of Allied research. A declassified US Navy intelligence brief from 1968 notes, "Hull analysis suggests performance parameters consistent with propulsion speeds exceeding 20 knots submerged. If derived from German wartime prototype, implications for Soviet undersea development are considerable." The file was immediately reclassified, but beyond the technical mystery lay unanswered human questions. Who crewed U-13X? No official Kriegsmarine roster lists such a vessel, yet rumors persisted among surviving U-boat veterans. In an interview conducted in 1959 with a former engineer from the Kiel Yard, he described volunteers from the U-boat Waffe promised exemption from Atlantic patrols in exchange for test duty. He recalled men transferred under the cover of training detachment assignments who were never seen again. Their names do not appear in war graves registries, nor in post-war POW lists. Some have speculated that the entire crew perished during trials, entombed when the submarine malfunctioned. Others suggest the wreckage recovered in 1947 was only partial, that U-13X's main hull may still rest intact somewhere beneath the Baltic. Hydrographic surveys in the 1990s by independent divers near Gotland claimed to detect an anomalous structure lying in 80 meters of water. Swedish authorities denied the findings, yet the area remains restricted to maritime traffic. The most chilling element lies in Soviet archival hints. A defector from the Soviet Northern Fleet, interviewed by Norwegian intelligence in 1973, claimed that a German boat was studied in Murmansk after the war, stripped for secrets, then scuttled in the Barents Sea. He described its propulsion system as unlike anything we had. It burned liquid fire. The defector's testimony was dismissed by NATO at the time as unverifiable, but his details align with known hydrogen peroxide propulsion experiments. The gaps in the record, missing personnel files, vanished requisition forms, sealed Soviet archives, leave U-13X suspended between fact and myth. Historians attempting to reconcile the fragments have been thwarted by deliberate erasure. German wartime engineers connected to the Walter propulsion program were quietly absorbed into British and American research through Operation Surgeon and Operation Paperclip. Yet when asked about U-13X, those interviewed denied knowledge, often too quickly. One engineer, when pressed, responded simply, "That boat was not meant to exist." If U-13X truly reached operational trials, it represented a technological step that could have altered the undersea balance of power. Its disappearance, and the Soviet Union's silence on what was recovered, ensured the Allies never faced such a weapon in combat. Yet the secrecy surrounding its fate suggests that the vessel's legacy did not die with the Reich. Instead, it may have been reborn in the Cold War's silent oceans, its design hidden within Soviet nuclear submarines that would later stalk NATO convoys undetected. To this day, official naval histories omit any mention of U-13X. The wreck off Gotland, if it exists, lies sealed beneath decades of silt and secrecy. But the scattered fragments, an intercepted memorandum, a hull plate in Soviet hands, whispered testimony from forgotten engineers, tell enough of the story to suggest that in 1943, deep beneath the Baltic, the Kriegsmarine briefly reached a frontier of naval warfare that the rest of the world would not acknowledge for decades. The truth of U-13X remains buried in the cold water, another secret of a war that still refuses to end. On a humid morning in July 1952, dock workers at Bremerhaven watched a convoy of US Air Force C-54 Skymasters take off in tight succession from the nearby airfield. Their cargo manifests, stamped with Army Transportation Corps seals, listed only industrial scrap metal. Yet witnesses remembered the guards, American MPs with orders to keep civilians away, and Air Force officers who never answered questions. Among the civilian dockmen, rumors spread quickly. Those planes weren't carrying scrap. They were carrying something sealed, dangerous, and worth killing to protect. The operation had been prepared with clinical precision. Files later recovered from declassified fragments refer to it as Operation Eclipse, though the designation was never connected to any published US Army initiative. The surviving paperwork, barely legible through redactions, describes air transport of sensitive material, Bremerhaven to Westover AFB, July 12-14, 1952. Escort, 86th Air Transport Wing. What the papers don't mention are the German names written in the margins of a shipping list, scientists once tied to the SS Ahnenerbe Research Institute, men who should have been standing trial in Nuremberg, not boarding US aircraft. Interviews with Bremerhaven locals decades later provided disturbing detail. One dock worker, Heinrich Albers, recalled, "They loaded large containers, lead-lined, with stenciled numbers, but no labels. Some had radiation warning symbols scratched out. The guards wouldn't let us get close. It was not scrap metal." His testimony matched a surviving customs ledger, noting the weight of one cargo unit, far heavier than scrap, consistent with machinery or dense mineral loads. The scientists connected to the manifests raised further suspicions. Cross-referencing the names with German wartime personnel records reveals ties to SS programs dealing with archaeological expeditions, esoteric physics research, and even long-range weapon experiments. Yet instead of facing prosecution, these individuals were quietly transferred under American control. The files on their post-war careers are missing, except for one note in a State Department briefing to the National Security Council in August 1952. Certain Eclipse personnel resettled in New England under restricted immigration channels. Where did the cargo itself go? Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts, according to the limited surviving documentation. From there, the trail goes cold. Yet a memorandum from the Atomic Energy Commission, dated October 1952, contains an oblique reference to recent European acquisitions requiring secure underground storage. The memorandum is heavily censored, but the phrasing suggests that the cargo was not ordinary equipment, but potentially radioactive material. Historians later noted that in the same period, unexplained anomalies were logged at secure test sites. In Nevada, experiments described only as materials compatibility trials. British intelligence became aware of Eclipse almost immediately. A cable declassified in 1988, sent from London to Washington in September 1952, bluntly stated, "We have received credible reports of unregistered transfers from Bremerhaven. These involve ex-SS scientific personnel. Clarification is urgently required." The Americans responded with a single sentence: "Subject not recognized." The matter was dropped, filed under special handling. The secrecy surrounding Eclipse extended beyond the cargo itself. US Air Force flight logs from Bremerhaven to Westover during July 1952 were erased from the official ledger. Pilot names are absent, crew rosters blank. When former members of the 86th Air Transport Wing were interviewed in the 1970s, some recalled the flights but refused to speak on record. One, under condition of anonymity, described sealed containers loaded onto the aircraft at night, guarded not only by MPs but by men in civilian suits who identified themselves as special security. "They had Geiger counters," he said. "I saw them testing the crates before loading. That wasn't scrap." Even more curious are the civilian sightings en route. In Shannon, Ireland, where the Skymasters refueled, locals recalled the smell of chemicals as ground crews handled the planes. A refueling technician reported that one aircraft was leaking a faint metallic liquid, and US personnel immediately cordoned off the tarmac. The incident was never recorded in airport logs. The files on Eclipse were formally expunged from Army records in 1956, a fact revealed when the US National Archives accidentally released a destroyed records register. Among the entries, Operation Eclipse, air material transfer, expunged in entirety. Such total removal is rare, suggesting that the nature of the cargo or the identities of those involved were too compromising to leave even fragmentary evidence. Yet fragments did survive in unexpected places. In 2009, a researcher at the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz discovered a stray American intelligence summary from 1953. Buried within an economic report, it references technical material of German origin, transferred under Eclipse, now undergoing assessment at classified US site. The report lists no details, but its very inclusion in a trade briefing suggests the transfer was vast enough to impact industrial planning. The darker speculation concerns the possibility of nuclear or pre-nuclear research materials. Several of the German scientists connected to Eclipse were rumored to have worked on reactor experiments in Leipzig during the war. combined with lead-lined crates and radiation warnings. The implication is that American forces may have seized components or raw stock intended for a German nuclear program. Whether the material was complete or merely experimental remains unclear. Why then the secrecy decades later? Because if Eclipse represented a mass transfer of forbidden technology and personnel, it undermined the entire post-war narrative of justice. Men tied to SS institutions may have been protected not for their knowledge alone, but for the cargo they controlled. Cargo the Allies were willing to suppress trials and rewrite records to secure. No official acknowledgement of Eclipse has ever been made. Families of dock workers who witnessed the convoys recall being warned by American officials never to discuss what they saw. Survivors of the 86th Air Transport Wing describe an unspoken oath of silence, one that lasted their entire lives. The files remain closed, if they exist at all. All that is left are fragments, erased flight logs, censored memos, lead-lined crates that never reappeared, and the whispered memory of men in civilian suits with Geiger counters on a German airfield in the summer of 1952. Whether the cargo was technology, weapons material, or something stranger, its disappearance into American vaults marks one of the Cold War's earliest shadows, an inheritance of the Third Reich that no victor has ever admitted to carrying. In March 1946, 6 months after the guns of Europe fell silent, a joint Anglo-American survey team arrived in southern Italy to map abandoned Wehrmacht positions. South of Naples, at the edge of a half-collapsed vineyard road, they found a reinforced bunker half buried in volcanic rock. Inside, they expected rusting rifles and discarded uniforms. Instead, they discovered charred corpses in Wehrmacht field grey, their bodies burned beyond recognition, and fragments of machinery scattered across the floor. The air smelled of scorched insulation. On a half-melted casing, the surveyors noted the faint imprint of the Siemens corporate mark. The site was hastily documented in a field report dated March 19, 1946, stamped U.S. Army Engineering Corps, Naples Sector. The report, now preserved only in fragments, described a transmitter or resonant device of unknown configuration, apparently destroyed by fire. Attached was a sketch of a machine composed of concentric metal coils surrounding a central housing. The sketch vanished from archives decades later. Only the cover page remains. Within days, the bunker was demolished with explosives, its contents carted away under armed escort. Witnesses from a nearby village claimed they heard multiple detonations, echoing through the hills at night, followed by the roar of heavy trucks. The file referred to the device under a cryptic label: Projekt Nachklang, Project After Sound, or Echo. No surviving German document mentions the project by name, yet Siemens' wartime production logs show unexplained shipments of high-grade copper wire and quartz components to an SS-controlled depot outside Naples in late 1943. Historians who reviewed the ledgers noted the unusual nature of the order: wire, gauges and crystal oscillators not associated with radios or radar sets. One Siemens engineer interviewed in 1957 recalled hearing rumors of a long-wave transmitter built for the Wehrmacht, but admitted he never saw the device himself. What was Nachklang? The theories diverge. Some argue it was an experimental communications device designed to reach U-boats across the Atlantic without detection. Others suggest it was intended to interfere with Allied radio navigation by emitting resonant frequencies over vast distances. A declassified OSS intelligence note dated April 1946 contains a chilling line: field team reports effects consistent with harmonic resonance, not conventional broadcast. Prolonged exposure by witnesses produced headaches and vertigo. That note was immediately reclassified, then disappeared from circulation until rediscovered in the 1980s. The most unsettling detail came from the condition of the corpses. The official survey noted they were severely burned, despite no evidence of secondary fire in bunker. A local Italian medic called to examine the site remarked that the burns resembled radiation injury more than flame. His testimony was stricken from the report. Survivors from the survey team were later warned not to discuss what they had seen. One corporal, interviewed in 1971, stated, "It wasn't just a radio. The machine hummed even after the fire. We thought it was off, but you could feel it in your bones." Within weeks of the discovery, all references to Nachklang were scrubbed from US Army files. The demolition order for the bunker is signed only with initials, no full name. Italian municipal records list the site as hazardous waste disposal zone, though no such waste was ever stored there. When locals returned to the vineyard years later, they found the ground blackened, nothing growing on the soil. Hints of Nachklang reappeared during the Cold War. In 1958, British intelligence intercepted a Soviet research memo referencing captured harmonic resonance apparatus, Naples sector. The Soviets claimed the Americans had removed key components before demolition. The memo speculated that the US had transferred the surviving device to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, alongside other confiscated Axis technology. Washington denied the allegation, yet an internal Air Force budget request from 1959 contains an unexplained line item: resonance field trials, secure facility. No further description was attached. The erasure of Nachklang extends to corporate archives as well. Siemens post-war records show a deliberate gap in procurement logs for 1943-1944. When pressed in a 1960s inquiry by West German parliamentarians, the company insisted wartime files had been lost to bombing. Yet internal Siemens memoranda, released in 1994, after corporate restructuring, reveal nervous board discussions in April 1945 about liability for Naples research. One line reads, "Should Allied forces discover prototypes, disassociate all connection. Claim civilian equipment misappropriated by SS." To this day, no physical trace of the machine has resurfaced. The demolished bunker lies beneath layers of post-war construction. The US Army insists no such device was ever recovered. Yet, fragments remain, sketches of concentric coils, copper shipments that cannot be explained, medical notes describing radiation-like burns, and the name Nachklang, whispered through censored reports. The resonance device, whatever it was, appears to have been deliberately obliterated, not simply to deny it to the enemy, but to erase it from memory. Whether it was an unfinished prototype or a weapon too dangerous to acknowledge, Nachklang's legacy survives only in shadows. The burned men in Wehrmacht uniforms were erased, the bunker sealed, and the papers filed under layers of black ink. But the whispers never stopped. Among archivists who stumbled upon the fragments, a chilling phrase endures: "The machine hummed even after the fire." Every archive locked, every testimony silenced, every crater filled with concrete is a reminder. The war did not end, it only changed shape. The silence that follows is not peace, but complicity, a pact of forgetting. And in that silence, the ghosts remain, humming beneath the soil and paper trails. Some secrets were buried not to be forgotten, but because the truth was too dangerous to bear. The question is not if they existed, but who still guards them.